Hello, fifth graders. This is Mr. Miller. For today's literature anthology, we are going to be reading Ida B. And listen to this title and her future plans to maximize fun, avoid disaster, and possibly save the world. Now, this is an example of our genre, realistic fiction. And remember, realistic fiction has to have realistic people that are made up. They could be based on other characters, but they're not real people. And they have to experience situations that are realistic, that could happen, that are believable. So, Ida B, this is an excerpt from a larger piece of writing. And so, if we notice, it starts off with this text over here that is in italicized form. So, it's in italics. And that indicates that this is a little different from what's going to be in the rest of our reading. And because it's an excerpt, it's just section pulled out of a book, the writer has given us these two paragraphs to kind of set the stage and tell us what happened in the story prior to what we're going to read next. So let's listen to what the author wants us to know before we start reading.
Ida B. is an independent girl who loves spending time in her family's apple orchard. Unfortunately, Ida B.'s world turns upside down when her mother is diagnosed with cancer. Her parents are forced to sell part of the orchard to pay medical bills, which means that many of Ida B.'s beloved trees will be cut down to make room for houses. But that's just the beginning. Ida B. finds out that her days of being homeschooled are coming to an end and that she must attend public school. Upset by her mother's illness and her parents' decisions, Ida B. stubbornly decides to distance herself from her parents and new classmates. Instead, she chooses to spend time with her dog, Rufus, and cat, Lulu. But through the persistence and encouragement of her teacher, Ms. W., Ida B.'s iron will begins to dissolve.
All right, so from that introduction, what have we learned about our main character, Ida B? What does it mean that she's an independent girl that loves to spend time in her family's apple orchard? Well, it seems like she's pretty content, independent, but what happens to her world when her mother gets diagnosed with cancer? Well, it says it gets turned upside down. And the parents actually are forced to sell part of the orchard just to pay the bills. And then Ida also finds out that she is going to have to not be homeschooled, but have to attend a public school. So you can imagine that that's quite a bit of change. And Ida B apparently is going to run into some kind of problem when she gets to school because something is going to dissolve Ida B's iron will. So, good readers take the time to predict what's going to happen in the story. So, let's move on and let us continue on with the story. Now, you notice that this is no longer in italics. So, this is an excerpt from the book.
One day after lunch, Ms. W. told the class, "I know it's time to read, but I don't think I can do it today. My voice is too tired." She put her hand on her throat and scrunched up her face like something was paining her. It was the same face she'd made when Simone Martini was just about yelling across the room to Patrice Polinsky, and Miss W. would say, "Simone, use your inside voice. You are hurting my ears." Everybody looked up from their chattering or worksheets at just about the same time, in exactly the same direction, with the same expression on their faces, a mix of 30% shock, 20% disbelief, and 50% plain old sad. "Aw, man," Matthew Dribble said right out loud. I felt like the bottom had just dropped out of my stomach, and everything I ate for lunch was tumbling around in my gut. Nope, my voice is just too tired, Miss W said, and sure enough, it was sounding weak and raspy. And we were going to read Alexander Potemkin and the space shuttle to Planet Z, too. Well, that's disappointing.
All right, so far, um, because this is realistic fiction, do we have realistic characters? And how does the writer make the characters realistic? Let's start with Mrs. W. Does she talk like a teacher? Well, in this excerpt, in this section right here, she says, Simone, use your inside voice. You're hurting my ears. Now, is that something a teacher would say? And I would probably say yes. And then if we look at other dialogue, oh man, is a phrase, and nope, right here, nope, my voice is tired. Those are all little things that people say all the time. So let's continue on. Now, because we know Miss Washington's throat is sore, she's not going to be able to read a book. At this point, what do you predict might happen next? Is she going to get better? She's not going to get better. What do you think is going to happen? And remember, a good reader always adjusts what their predictions are as the story continues to progress. So let's listen to the next section of the story.
Miss W sat down, put her head in her hand, and her body wilted. Like not only was her voice tired, but every bone in her body needed a rest. Please, begged Alice May Grunderman. Please, Miss Washington? Asked Patrice and Simone at the same time with the same moon-eyed face. And then everybody got the idea, and it became a sort of song with a verse of, Please, Miss Washington, and a chorus of, Please, please, please. But Miss W's voice was deteriorating at an alarming speed, because now she could only speak in a hoarse whisper, and everybody had to stop with their pleasing just to hear her. I'm sorry, but I can't. She paused, and we could all tell by the look on her face that she was thinking hard, so we stayed quiet to give her some room. Maybe, she said, looking up and forcing a weak smile, we could have a guest reader just for today? Well, it was hard to imagine anybody but Ms. W reading, and we all just sat there for a minute. Then one by one, people started nodding their heads and looking at each other and nodding more and smiling, because nobody wanted to miss story time, not even Tina Politi, who usually slept through it. And after a couple of minutes of that, people started looking at Ms. W, nodding their heads real hard, sticking out their chests and saying out loud, I think that's a great idea, and yes, let's have a guest reader today. Because they were realizing that maybe they could be the guest reader and star student of the afternoon. They wanted to remind Ms. Washington that not only were they superb readers, but wonderful human beings, too.
All right, so Miss Washington has an idea, and it talks about her voice. And down here, when it says that, where is it? But Mrs. Washington's voice was deteriorating at an alarming speed. What do you suppose the word deteriorating means? And what if I didn't understand what that word was? Well, you can use sentence clues such as comparisons to figure out the meaning of the word deteriorating. How does Mrs. W's voice sound at the bottom of the page when it describes it as weak and raspy and hoarse whispering? That gives us a clue that her voice is getting fainter, and the kids actually had to stop talking and begging her to read so they could even hear what she had to say. So, by looking at the dialogue and the sentences around the word deteriorating, we can assume that the word means that her voice was getting weaker and weaker. The other part, when I read I use details from the story to predict what might happen next. I read that Mrs. W's voice is too tired to read, and she suggests a guest reader. Now, what do you suppose is going to happen about the guest reader? I predict that many of the students wanted to volunteer to read, but I don't think Ida will volunteer. Why do you think she won't volunteer? Well, she's independent. She tries to distance herself from her classmates. And if we look at this writing, who's the narrator? Well, the narrator is Ida herself. So this is a first person narration. And if you notice when she's talking and when she's observing her classmates, she notices everything. She notices their facial expressions. She notices um, the way they are talking. And that's the author's craft that helps set the picture so that you can see this happening in your mind. Now, why do you suppose all these kids want to volunteer? Well, in the last few sentences, it says they wanted to remind Miss Washington that they were superb readers. And remember, superb is one of our words. They're all very good readers, but they're wonderful human beings too, because they want to help out their teacher and read. So let's continue on with our story.
Especially Calvin Big-Headed Faribault, who actually raised his hand, and I just knew it was to volunteer out of the kindness of his big, fat, big-headed heart. But Ms. W. didn't even look in Calvin's direction. "Ida, since I know you've read the book," she said to me weakly, like it was her last request, "could you please read the first chapter today?" Well, I was so shocked and embarrassed, sitting there with my mouth wide open, that I almost couldn't tell that all the other kids were staring at me with their mouths wide open, too. Making words into story music like Ms. W. did was the one thing I wanted to do more than just about anything in the world. But telling a story out loud in front of my class at Ernest B. Lawson Elementary School was nearly the last thing I'd want to do in my entire life. I was so confused about whether I should be happy or scared. I just sat there. Ms. W. got up, walked over to me, put her face next to my stunned and frozen one, and whispered, "Ida, I need your help." And there I was, hypnotized by that woman again. I was like a dog that would go fetch Miss W's stick, even if it was in a snake's hole under a thorn bush that had just been sprayed by a skunk.
All right. So in this section, we have evidence that Ida is the narrator because I see words like I. And then when she describes everybody else, it's them. So I know it's a first person narration. Now, look at some of the word choice. How do you think Ida feels about the student named Calvin? Why would she say he's big headed? And he's raising his hand to volunteer out of kindness of his big, fat, big headed heart. So, very descriptive. And it kind of shows that Ida really is kind of distancing herself from the other children. And she was stunned when Miss W walked over and asked her for help. And because she liked her teacher, she was willing to do what her teacher asked, even though she thought it was a very difficult thing for her to do. And how do we know it was difficult? Well, if we look, she described it as she was being hypnotized by the woman and that she was just like a dog that would go fetch a stick. And because it was Mrs. Washington, that she would even go get the stick in a snake hole around a thorn bush that had been sprayed by a skunk. So that really kind of indicates, and it's a very good word choice because we can all identify with having to do something that both terrifies us, but we know to be kind, we should probably do. So I'm going to stop this video. Please go on to the next video when you're ready and think at this point, what's going to happen next? Make a prediction.